A few years ago, my wife and I rented a cabin for a long weekend. We wanted something secluded, away from the city. After some searching, we found a cabin located in a remote area, surrounded by woods and nature. It looked great, but to be honest, it was really even more secluded than we originally wanted. Access to the area was bad. We actually had to rent a four-wheel drive vehicle just to get in. That was an extra expense, but we decided to go for it anyway. According to the owner, the property was over 100 acres. Beyond that was public land. The borders were not clearly marked, but we didn't think it would matter anyway. We weren't planning on doing any hunting or anything like that. We arrived at the cabin on a Friday afternoon. The place was even more beautiful than the pictures had shown. It had a rustic charm and a spacious front porch with a cozy interior. After settling in, we spent the rest of the day relaxing and exploring the area. We went to bed early and fell asleep right away. The next day, we decided to go hiking on some trails that were close by. The woods behind the cabin was dense, and there were many well-worn trails running through. After a couple of hours, we stumbled upon what looked like a makeshift campsite. There was a clearing and a fire pit that still had some warm embers, so we knew somebody had been using it recently. That struck us as odd. We were supposed to be in a secluded area, and we were pretty sure we were still on the cabin's private land. We didn't worry about it for the rest of the day, and we returned to the cabin as evening set in. After dinner, we sat on the porch, enjoying the last hour or so of sunlight. We went to bed at around 11, exhausted from the day on the trail. My wife had fallen asleep right away, but I stayed awake for a while longer. I looked at my phone and saw that it was midnight. That's when I heard it. A subtle but distinct noise, like someone was quietly trying to open the front door. It was secured with an old-style lock, just a metal bar that slides in from the inside. Besides that, there was a doorknob lock, which didn't seem very secure. The sound continued for a few minutes, and then as suddenly as it started, it stopped. At that time, I was not even sure if it was my imagination. Because of that, I was actually able to fall asleep, although it took me another hour or two. In the morning, I didn't bother to tell my wife because I didn't want to scare her over nothing. We had another good day out there and nothing notable happened. When we went to bed, my wife fell asleep right away again, and again I heard noises from outside. This time I was sure of what I was hearing. I was wide awake, and I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the wooden porch. There was no sound like the night before. He wasn't trying to open the door, but there was definitely someone out there. I got out of bed as quietly as I could, and I grabbed my gun. I wasn't going to confront the guy, but I knew I needed to be ready. I tried to be quiet, but with one of my steps, the floor creaked. When that happened, I heard him run away, and the noises stopped. I continued walking to the front door, gripping my firearm tight. When I opened it, I cautiously stepped out onto the porch. I walked around for a few minutes, and then walked back up to the porch and looked out. The night was extra dark, with no sign of the moon at all. Off in the distance, I caught the glimpse of a light in the woods, a flashlight moving away from the cabin. Eventually, it disappeared, and I was left standing in the darkness. With that, I was downright certain that we had a visitor. I went back inside and double-checked all the locks. I laid awake for most of the night, but eventually fell asleep. When dawn broke, I told my wife what happened. We still had another night, but I knew we had to go that morning. It wasn't worth the risk. There was somebody out there, and he tried to break in the other night, and the night before as well. We packed up our stuff and went outside to load up the truck. As soon as I stepped out onto the porch, I saw something terrifying. A large section of the cabin's side was charred, as if somebody had tried to set it on fire. It was the whole corner of the building to the left of the front door, on the porch. The scent of gasoline lingered in the air, leaving no doubt about what happened. That guy came back after I was asleep, doused the whole place in gasoline, and then lit it on fire. Somehow we slept through the whole thing. Luckily, the dense wood of the cabin didn't catch that easily, and it went out before the logs went up. We went to check the truck, and fortunately, it seemed fine. As we drove away, I called the owner of the cabin and explained what happened. He was shocked and called the police. We never found out who was in the woods, or why they tried to harm us. The police investigated, but didn't find anyone out there. The woods out there are vast, but even still, It's hard to imagine a person surviving out there on their own. He must have had a place to live, or a vehicle of some kind, and if so, why couldn't they find him? It remains an unsolved mystery to this day. We were lucky to have escaped with our lives, but it was a close call that we'll never forget. Last summer, a crazy thing happened to me. My brother and I have always been close, but we also get on each other's nerves sometimes. We were driving back from a job site. We both work in construction, and we had been working on a house a few towns over from where we live. There was a single long highway that we would take to get home, and it was one of the most remote stretches of roads around there. We were on it for almost an hour, and there was nothing there, just fields on one side and trees on the other. Besides a dilapidated farmhouse or two, it was hard to tell 1 kilometer from the last. It was hot, and we were tired, and honestly, we were both pretty irritable. On the drive back, we were arguing and bickering a lot. It was over small stuff, music choice, and other crap like that. It really wasn't important. We were really just tired and hungry. Finally, something I said ticked him off big time. He pulled over abruptly, right to the shoulder of the country road, and told me to get out. At first, I thought he was joking, but his face was dead serious. We'd had fights before, but he had never done something like that. I remember thinking how ridiculous it was, being kicked out in the middle of nowhere. I decided to get out, because I knew he wouldn't really leave me out there. He just needed a minute to cool off. I slammed the door as I got out, and didn't say anything, not wanting to make it worse. He drove off, leaving a cloud of dust behind. I stood there, still pretty angry, but I figured he'd cool off and circle back in a few minutes. I checked my phone, and although I didn't have full service, emergency services were available, so at least I had that as a last resort. I kept walking down the road, watching my brother's truck. Just as it was about to disappear into the distance, I saw the truck stop. It was too far to see clearly, but I thought it was coming back to get me. I concentrated harder, trying to see what was going on. After a minute, he still hadn't turned around. A loud bang came from the direction of my brother's truck. I was pretty sure it was a gunshot. It hit me like a punch to the stomach. I broke out in a run towards the truck. I wasn't armed, but I had to help my brother. While I was running, I pulled out my phone and called 911. Luckily it worked, and I talked to the dispatcher. He told me to stay back, but I refused. As I got closer, I saw another car speeding away down the road. I didn't get a good look at it, just a cloud of dust and some faint red taillights. By the time I reached the truck, my brother was standing alone next to the driver's side door. He was smoking a cigarette, but he could hardly keep it still in his shaking hand. He told me that these 2 guys came out of nowhere, blocked the road, and tried to rob him. He had a gun in the car. We both did for safety, and he managed to fire a shot. He said that he didn't think he hit either of them, but it was enough to scare them off. We called the cops again and gave them as much information as we could. An officer came out to meet us. After a quick conversation, we were allowed to go, but I had to drive because my brother was too shaken up. By then, it was around 8 p.m. and it was almost dark. We wanted to get back to town before the sun went down because this remote road had no streetlights and it got incredibly dark. We headed out and the cop drove away in the opposite direction. Another 20 or 30 minutes down the road, we saw a car stopped on the shoulder. The lights were on, but it was just sitting there. My brother took one look and then said to me, "That's them." "Them from before?" I asked. He nodded. As we got closer, the car pulled out into the road, blocking our way. Right then, I looked in my rearview mirror and noticed another car pull onto the highway from a small road leading into one of the fields. There were 2 of them there, blocking us from both sides. I guess they were pissed that my brother shot at them before. I knew if we stopped, then we'd be in trouble. Those guys knew we were armed, and they came after us anyway. That could only mean that they were armed as well. Things had the potential to get really ugly out there, and I wanted no part of it. There was a deep ditch at either side of the road, and the shoulder was not wide enough to get around. That left us with only one option. I sped the truck up and stayed right in the middle of the road. Our work truck was a lot bigger than that car blocking us. I thought I could scare them into moving. As we got close, a bead of sweat dripped from my brow. I looked down for a split second. When I looked back up, the car had backed onto the right shoulder. I jerked the steering wheel to the left and just barely made it past without colliding. We got out of there and went straight home. My brother watched to make sure we weren't being followed. That night, I called the cops again to give them an update. It was like those guys were after us. We were both scared for weeks afterwards, thinking they were going to come after us. That didn't happen though, and we never saw them again. I still think of it from time to time when I'm on that road or a similar one. I still wonder what they would have done if we stopped. I went on a solo hiking trip last summer. I've been wanting to get out and challenge myself a little bit that year, so I decided on one of the more remote and difficult routes in my area. It was a 5-day loop, the longest I had done up until then. The first day of the hike was alright. The trail was rough. It was through dense forest and there were a lot of hills. It was exactly what I was after though, a challenge, both physical and mental. Once I hit the trail, it was like I was the only other person in the world. I didn't see another single person out there, even though there's a less challenging trail that overlaps with the first part. The parking area was basically empty as well, so I really wasn't expecting to see anyone else. I set up camp as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. It was peaceful. The sounds of the forest were surprisingly loud out there. The wind in the trees, the birds, even the wolves off in the distance. I had my tent up, a simple meal cooked on my portable stove, and the stars were just starting to show. On the second day, it rained for a few hours. I had a good raincoat, but I was still mostly soaked. By around 4 p.m., the rain stopped, and I was able to dry off before dark. After a full day of hiking, I found a place to set up camp for the night. I put my tent up and made some dinner. I then hoisted my food bag into a nearby tree. For those who don't know, that's a common thing that you have to do for bear safety. I was able to make a fire that night, even though most of the wood was damp. When the fire was starting to die down, I saw something in the forest through the trees. It looked like a flashlight beam, flickering in the distance. I squinted my eyes, trying to catch a glimpse of who else could be out there, miles from the nearest sign of civilization. But as suddenly as it appeared, the light was gone, swallowed up by the dense bush. I told myself it could be anything, another camper maybe. I decided not to investigate further and went to my tent. I eventually fell asleep to the sounds of the forest, thinking of that light as I did. When dawn broke, I unzipped my tent and stepped out into the daylight. What greeted me was pure chaos. My campsite was trashed, my food bag was gone. I thought at first that an animal got it, maybe a bear, but there were no tracks around, and on closer inspection, I could tell that the rope holding it up was cut with a knife. Then I turned to my tent and saw a single long cut down the outer fly layer. It was clear that somebody had cut from the top all the way down to the bottom. I knew a person had done it, and it really scared me. I was a 2-day hike from the nearest road, with no food and a trashed tent. It's possible to go weeks without food, so although I was hungry, I knew I could manage. I decided to pack up what remained of my gear and head back immediately. Even though it was 2 days in, it was faster to go back than to continue. I was going to try and push to make it in a single day. I thought of that flashlight from the night before. It creeped me out to think that somebody was watching my camp, waiting for me to sleep. I set out at a brisk pace, looking over my shoulder every few minutes. The journey back was grueling. I conserved energy as much as I could, but the lack of food made it difficult to keep going. By late afternoon, I saw something up ahead on the trail. It was another person, a single man it seemed. He was walking slowly, and I was catching up fast. It would have been comforting to run into another person out there, but I was feeling paranoid. What if that was the guy who attacked me? I slowed my pace, hoping not to meet him, but it seemed like no matter how much I slowed, the distance between us was still shrinking. Eventually, it became impossible not to pass the guy, unless I was going to stop altogether. When I was about 20 feet back, I shouted out hello, trying to sound as friendly as possible. The man then turned around and stood in the middle of the trail. He was a little older than me, probably in his 40s. I was 34. The man didn't look like a hiker. He wore ripped blue jeans and a cotton hoodie. Not the best choice for these trails.
"How's your day going?"
he asked. I answered and tried to be as pleasant as I could. I had a strong suspicion that this was the guy who ransacked my site, but I didn't want to show it. The guy had a large-looking knife on his belt, so I was nervous. Just as I was about to walk past him, he called out to me.
"Hey, One more thing.
I turned back, and the man reached into his bag, pulled something out. It was my food bag that had been stolen the other night. It was empty now, and it looked ripped apart.
Is this yours?
He asked. Yeah, I think so, I mumbled. He held it out as if he was expecting me to take it. I walked over and grabbed it from his hands.
I found it in the bushes back there. Thought it might be yours.
The guy told me. It was a tense moment. It was like we both knew what he did, but neither of us wanted to say it. To him, it seemed like a sick game, but for me, I just wanted to get out of there without any more trouble. I took the bag and walked away quickly. By the time the sun began to set, I felt exhausted. Every part of me ached, and my stomach was a tight knot. I had to stop, even though I wanted nothing more than to push on through the night. I found a small clearing, and without any energy to set up a proper camp, I simply rolled out my sleeping bag under a tree and lay down. I didn't light a fire that night. I didn't want to attract any more attention. I laid there in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the forest, and wondered if I'd see that flashlight again, but there was nothing. The next day was a blur. I walked and stumbled my way along the trail, my mind singularly focused on putting one foot in front of the other. It was the afternoon when I finally emerged from the trees and saw the road where I parked my car days before. Never had a dusty gravel road look so beautiful. I did report what happened, but to this day, I've not heard any update from the police. It's been over a year, so I think that's probably not going to happen. Although it was a truly terrifying experience for me, to the cops, a missing bag of food is hardly the crime of the century. I doubt they put much effort into it. This story didn't happen to me. It happened to a friend of my family, who's also a volunteer fire chief, an industrial firefighter, EMT, and a fire investigator for my county. I was told this story when he came to my Firefighter 1 class to teach us about the basics of fire investigation and how firefighters can assist in fire investigations on scene. In 2009, there was a large garage explosion and a fire out in a rural area in my county. My own fire department responded for mutual aid, but this was 6 years before I joined. When a working fire is declared in my county, the county's team of fire investigators is also notified to respond. The garage was filled with cars, some of them decades old, and it took a while to extinguish. A while later, when the fire was out, the fire investigators began to take pictures of what was left of the garage and the cars inside. The garage had effectively burned to the ground by that point. As they were taking photographs of the garage, one of the photographers on the team noticed something odd in the hollowed-out remains of a pickup truck. As he peered inside, he noticed something white in the driver's seat and took a photo of it. As he continued to look at it, he soon realized that it was in fact a skeleton. The owner of the garage, who had been missing since the fire, had in fact died in it. It's believed that he was in the garage when the explosion occurred and died shortly after from smoke inhalation or burns. His death was ruled accidental, as he had several propane tanks that he was working on inside the garage, and several of them exploded. I have seen the pictures, and I was shocked to see the skeleton when I finally noticed it. He had been burned so thoroughly that his skeleton blended in very well with the wreckage of the truck, hence why it took so long for anyone to notice it, despite firefighters, police officers, and investigators walking right past the truck several times. I only hope that his death was not too painful.